Imagine a high-security subterranean bunker housing the central mainframe computer of a sovereign global empire, completely sealed behind concrete walls and guarded by automated security checkpoints that inspect every single atom attempting to cross the perimeter. Suddenly, a silent structural failure inside the ventilation tracts begins to quietly bypass the checkpoints, allowing highly toxic, unfiltered ambient industrial smog to leak straight onto the delicate silicon circuit boards. For over a century, classical neurology treated the human brain as an unyielding, pristine biological sanctuary, completely isolated from the metabolic volatility and immune chaos running through your systemic bloodstream. But an historic, breakthrough discovery published this month by the Stanford University School of Medicine has shattered this fundamental dogma. Your brain's border control network is not a static, impenetrable wall. It is a highly volatile dynamic system that, under modern environmental stress, is undergoing a catastrophic, widespread structural collapse. The Stanford data has exposed an invisible, silent pandemic, the Stanford Leak, a profound breakdown of your brain's microvascular checkpoints that is causing toxic blood-borne molecules to aggressively breach the sanctuary, flooding your gray matter in a destructive chemical tide that rewrites your cognitive limits and threatens your psychological survival. To grasp the absolute gravity of the Stanford Leak, we must map the fundamental engineering of your brain's primary security fence, the blood-brain barrier, or triple B. Your brain contains an immense, sprawling network of blood vessels spanning over 400 miles of cumulative length, ensuring that every single neuron sits less than a hair's breadth away from a life-giving capillary. But these are not standard blood vessels. While capillaries in your liver or muscles are highly porous, allowing fluids to slosh through easily, the brain capillary endothelial cells, or BCEs, are tightly woven together like an unbroken sheet of industrial armor. This interface forms a highly selective molecular filtration matrix. It acts as a strict biological border control system, allowing vital glucose, oxygen, and amino acids to pass through specialized transport gates, while forcefully blocking out plasma proteins, systemic immune cells, environmental toxins, and circulating pathogens, maintaining a pristine, low-voltage chemical environment that is absolutely mandatory for clean synaptic computation. The landmark August 2026 Stanford Medicine datasets have revealed that in the modern human brain, this selective molecular filtration matrix is experiencing a catastrophic, nonlinear structural decay. Utilizing advanced single-cell transcriptomics and high-resolution spatial tractography, Stanford researchers tracked the structural integrity of over 100,000 independent brain capillaries. The results are an absolute medical alarm. The data revealed that across large demographic cohorts, the brain capillary endothelial cells are physically pulling apart, leaving microscopic structural gaps in the perimeter fence. This is the anatomical reality of the Stanford Leak. Your brain's border control is suffering a widespread checkpoint failure. This breach means your cerebral tissue is no longer insulated from the metabolic chaos of your body. The delicate, high-precision extracellular fluid bathing your neurons is being continuously cross-contaminated by unfiltered systemic blood, exposing your cognitive architecture to immediate, unregulated chemical interference. To understand how these microscopic structural gaps form, we must zoom directly into the submicroscopic scaffolding holding your endothelial cells together, the tight junction complex. Endothelial cells do not merely touch. They are fused together by an intricate interlocking web of transmembrane proteins that act like structural welding beads along the seams of the blood vessel. This weld is managed by three primary protein networks, Claudin-5, Occludin, and the intracellular anchoring matrix known as zonular occludins 1, or SO1. Together, These proteins build an incredibly tight, low-resistance electrical seal that completely closes the paracellular pathways between adjacent cells. In a healthy brain, this tight junction scaffold prevents any molecule larger than 400 daltons from passing through the cracks. The Stanford Leak is, at its core, a molecular disassembly of this exact welding bead, a systemic failure where the transmembrane proteins lose their structural integrity and disintegrate, leaving the doors of your brain wide open to the external world. The Stanford dataset has exposed that this molecular disassembly is directly triggered by a severe structural failure occurring just outside the blood vessel walls, the pericyte defection. Pericytes are specialized contractile neural cells that wrap their long muscular arms around the exterior surface of your brain capillaries, acting as the primary structural stabilization anchors for the endothelial gate. Pericytes are the unsung heroes of your brain's border control. They continuously transmit vital chemical growth factors directly to the endothelial cells, commanding them to manufacture Claudin-5 and keep the tight junctions tightly sealed. But the Stanford tracking data revealed that under modern chronic stress profiles, pericytes undergo a pathologically rapid process of detachment and apoptosis. They let go of the vessels and die. Without their pericytic anchors, the endothelial cells lose their primary survival signals, causing their tight junction manufacturing software to immediately freeze, leading to the rapid structural collapse of the paracellular seal. This outer structural collapse cascades instantly into the primary communication bridge of the blood-brain barrier matrix, the perivascular astrocytic end feet. Astrocytes are massive, star-shaped glial cells that act as the master logisticians of your brain, bridging the gap between your physical blood vessels and your computing neurons. Astrocytes extend broad, multi-layered sheets of cellular tissue known as end feet that completely wrap around the brain capillaries, forming a secondary protective outer sheath that regulates local blood flow and manages nutrient transport. In a healthy brain, these astrocytic end feet sit flush against the endothelial wall, maintaining an unbroken high-density physical seal. But the Stanford breakthrough revealed that during the leak cascade, astrocytes enter a state of severe reactive astrogliosis. They pull back their arms. The end feet retract away from the capillary walls, leaving the underlying blood vessels completely bare, uninsulated, and exposed to localized structural deformation, shattering the barrier's multi-layered defense model. The retraction of the astrocytic end feet triggers the immediate high-voltage activation of a destructive enzymatic cleanup crew inside your vascular walls, the matrix metalloproteinase 9 cascade, or MMP9. MMP9 is an endopeptidase enzyme that your brain naturally uses in tiny, highly controlled amounts to reshape its tissues during development or clear away localized damage. But when the endothelial cells lose their pericytic and astrocytic anchors, they fire a frantic, desperate chemical distress signal that forces an immediate, uncontrolled explosion of MMP9 synthesis inside the extracellular matrix. The enzyme runs completely wild. MMP9 acts like an aggressive chemical solvent, forcefully chewing through the baseline vascular basement membrane and actively digesting the remaining Claudin-5 and Occludin tight junction proteins. It is a state of autoimmune self-consumption. Your brain's own enzymatic machinery actively eats away the remaining security gates, accelerating the Stanford Leak into a runaway, uninhibited chain reaction of structural destruction. The moment the wild MMP9 solvent completely dissolves the tight junction welds, the ultimate physical threat of the Stanford Leak materializes, the unregulated infiltration of plasma-derived fibrinogen into your gray matter. Fibrinogen is a massive, highly reactive clotting protein that floats in high concentrations through your systemic bloodstream, entirely harmless as long as it remains locked inside your blood vessels. But when it breaches the dissolved endothelial gate and leaks directly into the brain's extracellular space, it behaves like a highly toxic corrosive poison. The brain's delicate neural tissue has never evolved to handle direct contact with raw blood plasma. The Stanford single-cell data demonstrated that the moment fibrinogen touches a neuron, it instantly disrupts the delicate balance of extracellular potassium and sodium ions, completely short-circuiting the cell's electrical fields, destabilizing its resting membrane potentials, and paralyzing its capacity to transmit clean action potentials. The raw presence of infiltrating fibrinogen inside your gray matter triggers an immediate maximum alert panic response from the brain's primary immune defenders, the microglia. Microglia possess highly sensitive surface receptors specifically engineered to detect plasma proteins. Under normal conditions, because fibrinogen is locked inside the vessels, these receptors never fire. But the moment the Stanford Leak allows fibrinogen to cross the threshold, the microglia interpret this exposure as a catastrophic, life-threatening physical brain trauma, as if the skull has been fractured or a blood vessel has ruptured. They instantly toggle into a state of hyperactivated aggressive phagocytosis. They morph from calm, branching cleaners into round, mobile combat cells rushing to the site of the leak and releasing a continuous toxic cloud of pro-inflammatory cytokines, including interleukin-1 beta and interleukin-6, directly into the surrounding neural tissue, setting off a chronic, low-grade internal wildfire that consumes everything in its path. Simultaneously, the broken endothelial gate permits the uninhibited breach of another massive, destructive blood plasma protein straight into your cognitive networks, albumin. In your body, albumin is a vital transport protein that regulates blood volume, but inside the brain, it acts as a direct neurotoxic agent that targets your primary helper cells. When albumin leaks across the dissolved tight junctions, it binds aggressively to specialized TGF-beta receptors located on the surface of your astrocytes. This binding permanently corrupts the astrocyte's internal processing software. The helper cells stop performing their critical housekeeping tasks. They stop vacuuming up excess glutamate, they lose their capacity to regulate potassium balances, and they stop feeding nutrients to your neurons. Instead, the poisoned astrocytes join the hyperactivated microglia in releasing massive concentrations of inflammatory neurotoxins, transforming your brain's primary support staff into a collection of hostile, self-destructive threats that actively drive synaptic failure. The poisoning of the astrocytic network by infiltrating blood albumin triggers a devastating downregulation of your brain's primary chemical vacuum cleaners, the EAT2 glutamate transporters. Excitatory amino acid transporter 2, or EAT, is a critical protein pump that astrocytes use to rapidly clear away excess glutamate from your synaptic clefts after a thought is fired. In a healthy brain, this clearance must happen in milliseconds to prevent chemical overcrowding. But under the influence of albumin toxicity, the manufacturing of EAT2 pumps drops to a historic lifetime deficit. The vacuum cleaners break. Glutamate, the brain's primary excitatory signaling chemical, begins to accumulate uncontrollably inside your synaptic spaces. It overflows the tracts. This chemical overcrowding creates a lethal environment where your neurons are subjected to continuous, uncoordinated, and high-frequency electrical stimulation that they lack the metabolic energy to sustain or stop. The accumulation of excess glutamate due to EAT2 decay launches a direct catastrophic assault on your neurons known as the excitotoxic cascade. When glutamate clogs the synaptic cleft, it binds continuously to specialized NMDA and AMPA receptors, forcing the postsynaptic cell's channel gates to remain permanently locked open. The floodgates are torn down, Extracellular calcium ions rush into the neuron at an uncontrollable high-velocity volume. This sudden, massive calcium influx completely overwhelms the cell's internal buffering capacity. The high calcium saturation acts like an internal self-destruct command, ripping through the delicate internal membranes, destroying the cytoskeleton of your dendritic spines, and triggering the rapid release of apoptotic enzymes that literally digest the neuron from the inside out. Your synapses are quite literally burning to death in a toxic chemical fire driven entirely by a border control network that can no longer close its gates. As your neurons succumb to the excitotoxic calcium fire, the hyperactivated cytokine-fueled microglia enter a state of destructive synaptic pruning overdrive. Under normal conditions, microglia carefully trim away old, underutilized connections to keep your networks efficient. But under the influence of the Stanford Leak, the microglial guards completely lose their internal editing filters. They mistake the damaged, glutamate-choked synapses for hostile waste that must be immediately destroyed to save the machine. They begin to indiscriminately devour healthy, vital dendritic connections across your higher cognitive centers. This is the neurobiology of structural erasure. The dense, multi-layered neural networks that hold your decades of hard-won knowledge, your professional expertise, and your core cognitive strategies are systematically chewed away by your own immune cells, leaving your cortex structurally stripped and hollowed out right behind your forehead. Right behind your forehead. The structural hollowing of the gray matter is dramatically accelerated by the complete destruction of your brain's master waste clearance system, the glymphatic matrix. Your brain does not possess a traditional lymphatic system. Instead, it relies on the rhythmic, high-pressure flow of cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, through the perivascular spaces to flush away metabolic waste, such as amyloid beta and tau proteins, while you sleep. This flushing action is entirely dependent on the precise geometric alignment of your perivascular astrocytic end feet, which utilize specialized aquaporin 4 water channels to pump the cleaning fluid through the tissue. But when the Stanford Leak forces the astrocytic end feet to retract and snap their anchors, the aquaporin 4 channels lose their alignment and scatter randomly across the tissue. The glymphatic pumps fail. The plumbing system of your brain blocks up completely. The metabolic sewage generated by your daily thoughts can no longer be flushed away, causing it to accumulate inside your gray matter, forming toxic aggregations that accelerate network decay. The combination of an unflushed glymphatic matrix, an excitotoxic calcium fire, and a continuous influx of raw blood plasma culminates in the physical establishment of the vascular brain fog core. Popular culture frequently treats brain fog as a trivial temporary mood, a soft consequence of a bad night's sleep or a poor diet. But the uncompromising data from the Stanford University datasets has exposed that true chronic brain fog is a severe microvascular pathology. Your higher cognitive centers are quite literally drowning in an unfiltered soup of systemic blood waste, inflammatory cytokines, and excess glutamate. The neural conduction velocity along your axons drops to an all-time low. Signals that should flash across your hemispheres at hundreds of miles per hour face extreme electrical resistance and voltage leaks, forcing your conscious mind to expend double the metabolic energy just to process a basic word, remember a simple number, or follow a standard line of thought. This drop in neural conduction velocity inflicts immediate severe structural disruption on the master executive command deck of your attention, the frontoparietal control network, or FPCN. The FPCN relies on absolute microvascular insulation to send high-velocity, synchronized top-down instructions from your prefrontal cortex straight to your distant parietal nodes, allowing you to filter out external noise and hold a long-term abstract goal inside your working memory. But when the Stanford Leak floods the intermediate white matter pathways with fibrinogen and albumin, the synchronized lines of communication are completely severed. The mesocortical and frontoparietal cables enter a state of severe desynchronization. Your internal CEO loses its grip on the cortex. You find yourself completely unable to sustain focus on tedious, highly complex, abstract tasks, entering a state of chronic executive fragmentation, where your mind drifts helplessly between low-effort digital distractions, bankrupted by a system that cannot maintain its internal electrical shielding. As your executive frontoparietal networks are disconnected by the microvascular leak, your brain's internal narrative engine, the default mode network, enters a state of uncontrolled, toxic overheating. In a healthy brain, the DMN is kept under strict prefrontal lock and key, silenced the moment it is time to perform an external action. But when your executive brakes are disassembled by the border control failure, the DMN captures 100% of your remaining cerebral voltage. It runs hot and unopposed. Because your DMN is now continuously bathed in the pro-inflammatory cytokines released by hyperactivated microglia, its narrative generation becomes deeply dark and catastrophic. The DMN stops building a balanced story of your life and begins running an autonomous, non-stop loop of ambient anxiety and self-criticism. Your internal monologue is hijacked by an immune system running an existential panic script, hardwiring a state of chronic psychological insecurity directly into your identity at the cellular floor. The mapping of this multi-layered microvascular disaster completely obliterates the popular cultural myth surrounding traditional self-help, cognitive behavioral therapy, and positive mindset hacks. We live in a society that continuously bombards individuals suffering from chronic brain fog, executive failure, and ambient anxiety with aggressive demands to just push through it, change your attitude, or use raw discipline to force a mental transformation. But the cold, uncompromising data from Stanford Medicine proves these superficial demands are a total biological insult. You cannot use a motivational quote to forcefully rebuild a dissolved Claudin-5 tight junction scaffold. You cannot use pure willpower to command a hyperactivated microglial cell to stop its cytokine storm, or force a poisoned astrocytic cell to regrow its retracted end feet. The Stanford Leak is a physical, hardware-driven border control failure of your brain's microvasculature. Treating this deep structural sickness with shallow mindset hacks is an exercise in total futility, because you are trying to write new software for a computer whose physical circuit boards are currently drowning in raw acid. If this microvascular border control failure is allowed to remain unchecked for years, the Stanford Leak transitions from a chronic state of cognitive impairment into a rapid linear path to accelerated neurodegeneration. The continuous, unregulated exposure to blood plasma proteins acts as a powerful epigenetic accelerator that fast-forwards your brain's biological clock by decades. The persistent microglial aggression and astrocytic poisoning completely halt your brain's natural neuroplastic repair mechanisms. Your capacity to manufacture neurotrophic growth factors like BDNF flatlines. The structural bedrock of your mind enters a phase of progressive volume loss, heavily predisposing your system to the early aggressive onset of early-stage vascular dementia, clinical Alzheimer's pathology, and permanent cognitive decline. The brain completely loses its structural reserve account, systematically running out of the baseline neural circuitry required to defend your human identity against the natural aging process. We have now mapped the complete, devastating 20-block architectural blueprint of Phase 1 of the Stanford Leak, arriving at the absolute threshold of the Stanford breakthrough. The microvascular rules of your lifespan are uncompromising and mathematically unyielding. What began as a silent dissolution of the Claudin-5 tight junction welds has successfully cascaded through your entire biology, detaching your pericytic anchors, retracting your astrocytic end feet, and releasing wild MMP9 solvents to destroy the paracellular seal. This structural breakdown permits a toxic influx of fibrinogen and albumin straight into your gray matter, triggering an uncoordinated microglial cytokine storm, a lethal excitotoxic calcium fire, and the total destruction of your glymphatic waste matrix, leaving your executive control networks completely disconnected and your identity captured by an overheated default mode network. This is the complete dark diagnostic reality of the border control breakdown, a physical biological crisis that demands an immediate, multi-layered structural intervention to forcefully repair the gates and secure the sanctuary before the network collapses into absolute permanent degradation. We have now witnessed the cold, uncompromising diagnostic reality of Phase 1, mapping the precise microvascular mechanics of the Stanford Leak and tracing how a total failure of the brain's endothelial tight junctions allows a toxic wave of raw blood plasma to flood your grey matter, trigger a destructive excitotoxic fire, and completely sever your executive networks. But to defeat a border control failure of this magnitude, we must descend even deeper into the submicroscopic architecture of the machine. In our next installment, we will leave the macro vessels behind and plunge straight into the ultimate molecular matrix of Phase 2. We will examine the exact biochemical triggers that drive Claudin-5 disintegration, map the devastating reality of the astrocytic drift, and expose the hidden, terrifying blueprint of how your brainstem computing cores begin to drown in systemic metabolic waste, unlocking the precise molecular data required to prepare your system for the ultimate structural repair protocol that awaits. Imagine standing inside the server room of that high-security bunker and discovering that the smog leaking through the vents is not just settling on the surfaces, but is actively executing a precise chemical reaction that targets the microscopic copper screws holding the motherboards to the rack. The moment those screws dissolve, the entire hardware array physically slides off the frame, tearing out its own fiber optic lines and plunging the entire network into absolute pitch-black structural chaos. This is the exact subcellular reality that the Stanford University School of Medicine dataset has exposed within the molecular matrix of Phase 2. The Stanford Leak is not a vague, generalized weakness of the blood vessels. It is a highly targeted subcellular siege that attacks the ultra-precise atomic bonds of your tight junction proteins. As we pass the threshold of the first phase, we must descend past the macro vessels and drop straight onto the molecular floor of the barrier, tracking the precise biochemical signals that dismantle your Claudin-5 welds, force your astrocytes to drift away from their targets, and leave your brain's most sacred computing cores to drown in raw, unfiltered metabolic waste. Unfiltered. To decode the subcellular siege, we must analyze the exact molecular architecture of your brain's primary gatekeeper protein, Claudin-5, or CLDN5. Claudin-5 is a highly specialized 4-transmembrane domain protein that loops out of the endothelial cell membrane like a microscopic loop of high-tensile wire. When two adjacent endothelial cells meet, their Claudin-5 loops mesh together at an atomic level, creating an extraordinarily tight, hydrophobic seal that completely blocks the passage of water-soluble ions. This atomic bond is the ultimate defensive line of human consciousness. But the late 2026 Stanford single-cell transcriptomic tracking has revealed that under the influence of modern inflammatory signaling, a destructive molecular signal called phosphorylation is launched against this loop. Specialized intracellular enzymes add a highly charged phosphate group straight to the tail of the Claudin-5 molecule. This sudden electrical change alters the shape of the protein. The loop distorts, the atomic mesh breaks apart, and the high-tensile wire welds literally unwind at an atomic level, leaving the paracellular gate wide open. The atomic disassembly of Claudin-5 triggers an immediate, downstream uncoupling cascade that destroys the remaining interior structural supports of the tight junction weld, the Occludin and Zo1 matrix. While Claudin-5 manages the exterior seal, Occludin acts as the primary stabilizer that regulates gate flexibility, while zonular Occludin's 1, or Zo1, behaves like an interior steel bracket that anchors these transmembrane proteins straight to the actin cytoskeleton inside the cell. In a healthy border control checkpoint, these three components form a single, high-density structural unit. But the Stanford molecular mapping demonstrated that during the phosphorylation wave, the internal anchoring brackets of Zo1 experience rapid proteolytic degradation. The steel brackets are melted down. Zo1 uncouples from the cell wall. Without their internal anchoring brackets, the remaining Occludin and Claudin-5 molecules lose their physical tension, floating away from the cell junctions like unmoored ships in a storm, completely disassembling the internal structural scaffolding of the barrier. As the tight junction scaffolding disassembles from within, the perivascular astrocytic end feet undergo profound pathological detachment, known as the astrocytic drift. In a healthy border control matrix, astrocytes are held flush against the capillary walls by an incredibly dense mesh of specialized adhesive glycoproteins dominated by dystroglycan and agrin. This glycoprotein mesh behaves like an organic industrial Velcro, keeping the astrocytic end feet permanently locked in place against the endothelial basement membrane. But the Stanford dataset has exposed that during the leak cascade, the hyperactivated microglia release high concentrations of a destructive cleaving enzyme called matrix metalloproteinase 2, or MMP2. This enzyme behaves like a chemical blade, specifically targeting and slicing through the dystroglycan Velcro. The adhesive mesh is severed. The astrocytic end feet lose their grip, experiencing a slow physical drift away from the blood vessels, leaving the underlying endothelial gate completely detached from the brain's metabolic management grid. The physical detachment of the astrocytic drift forces the starved endothelial cells into a highly dangerous, self-destructive survival maneuver known as the angiogenic paradox. Recognizing that they are losing their structural anchors and experiencing localized hypoxia due to astrocytic withdrawal, the endothelial cells fire a frantic, uncontrolled blast of vascular endothelial growth factor, or VEGF. In theory, VEGF is designed to stimulate the growth of healthy new blood vessels to boost oxygen supplies. But in the absence of a stable pericytic and astrocytic scaffold, this growth factor blast causes a chaotic, highly pathologically deformed process of vessel sprouting. The brain begins to rapidly grow millions of microscopic, hyperfragile, and inherently deformed new capillaries. These sprouted vessels lack any tight junction engineering whatsoever. They are built completely open and porous, behaving like thousands of freshly ruptured pipes that aggressively accelerate the influx of blood plasma into your gray matter, transforming a localized leak into a widespread systemic flood. While the paracellular pathways are blown wide open by tight junction disassembly and porous vessel sprouting, the interior of the endothelial cells undergoes a secondary catastrophic breakdown, the transendothelial vesicular surge. In a healthy border control checkpoint, the interior of the cell is a highly restricted zone. Molecules that cannot pass between the cells are strictly forbidden from passing through the cells. This control is managed by a process called transcytosis, where the cell uses tiny, highly regulated fluid bubbles called vesicles to transport a minute handful of vital molecules across its internal cytoplasm. This transport is kept at a near-zero baseline by a specialized inhibitory protein called MFG8. But the Stanford molecular data revealed that during the leak cascade, the genetic expression of the MFG8 protein is completely silenced. The internal brakes are removed. The endothelial cytoplasm is instantly flooded with millions of unregulated transport vesicles, which begin to careen through the cell interior, swallowing up massive, unfiltered quantities of blood plasma and dumping them directly into your cognitive networks, bypassing the paracellular gates entirely. The combined payload of the paracellular leak and the transendothelial vesicular surge triggers the immediate aggressive infiltration of a secondary highly destructive immune strike force from your body into your grey matter, the perivascular macrophages. In a healthy brain, these aggressive systemic immune cells are strictly quarantined inside the blood vessel lumen, entirely unable to cross the tight endothelial gate. But the Stanford transcriptomic tracking demonstrated that the moment the Claudin-5 welds drop below a critical structural threshold, these massive combative white blood cells forcefully squeeze through the paracellular gaps. They breach the border. Once inside the perivascular spaces, the macrophages fail to recognize the neural tissue as self. They mistake your grey matter for an infected external wound site. They join forces with the hyperactivated microglia, releasing an intense secondary wave of destructive pro-inflammatory cytokines and reactive oxygen species, launching an uncoordinated multi-pronged immune assault that accelerates synaptic decay. The unregulated influx of systemic white blood cells and plasma proteins begins to drift downward through the perivascular spaces, causing a terrifying localized phenomenon known as the drowning of the brainstem computing cores. Your brainstem houses the absolute master control nodes for your autonomic survival machinery, including the locus coeruleus, the dorsal raphe nucleus, and the ventral tegmental area. These deep subcortical cores are packed with hyperdense clusters of monoaminergic neurons that manage your body's baseline wakefulness, serotonin balance, and dopamine drive. Because these cores are hypervascularized, the Stanford spatial tractography datasets revealed that they experience the highest absolute volume of microvascular leakage during a border control failure. The delicate monoaminergic neurons are quite literally drowned in a corrosive soup of fibrinogen, albumin, and systemic macrophages, short-circuiting their electrical membranes and paralyzing their electrical membrane, neurotransmitters required, awake, motivated, and emotionally stable. Keep your... The drowning of the subcortical cores inflicts immediate, severe structural damage on the ultimate wakefulness factory of your entire nervous system, the locus coeruleus, or LC. Nestled within the posterior pons of the brainstem, the LC is an ultra-compact cluster of specialized neurons responsible for synthesizing and spraying norepinephrine across your entire cortex. This noradrenergic spray is the literal electrical current that determines your baseline cognitive alertness, your visual processing speed, and your working memory resolution. But under the direct influence of fibrinogen toxicity and macrophage-induced neuroinflammation, the locus coeruleus neurons undergo a profound pathological downregulation. The electrical current fades out. The LC's firing frequency drops to a historic lifetime deficit. Your brain's internal power grid enters a permanent, low-voltage state. You enter a state of chronic, unyielding lethargy, where your conscious mind feels perpetually exhausted, dull, and completely unable to achieve a high state of intellectual sharpness, no matter how many external stimulants you consume. Simultaneously, the microvascular leak cascade spreads laterally into the primary dopamine factory of your motor and motivational routing systems, the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra contains the hyper-specialized dopaminergic cell clusters that fuel your basal ganglia loops, providing the essential chemical pressure required to release your subcortical motor brakes and authorize physical movement. When the Stanford Leak floods this delicate midbrain structure with blood plasma proteins, the local microglia undergo an exceptionally aggressive toxic transformation. They begin to release high concentrations of a destructive free radical called peroxynitrite directly into the dopaminergic cell fields. This localized oxidative storm causes an immediate, severe exhaustion of the substantia nigra's metabolic capacity. The cells lose their ability to synthesize dopamine, at a baseline level, locking your basal ganglia loops of high resistance, making the physical act of initiating a task, moving your limbs, or executing a basic routine feel like an immense, exhausting uphill battle. A basic routine. The downward drift of the microvascular leak reaches its absolute metabolic floor as it infiltrates the primary control center for your endocrine system and your biological rhythm, the hypothalamus. Tightly nestled above the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus contains the exclusive neural clusters responsible for managing your baseline body temperature, your thyroid axis, and your master circadian clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. When the Stanford Leak floods the hypothalamic perivascular spaces with plasma albumin, it disrupts the delicate, high-precision receptor networks that listen to your internal hormone loops. The SCN enters a state of profound circadian desynchronization. Your internal clock loses its connection to reality. The brain loses its physical capacity to understand when it is day and when it is night, completely disrupting your nocturnal melatonin secretion and flatlining your daytime cortisol awakening response, leaving you trapped in a state of permanent internal jet lag, where you are perpetually tired during the afternoon, yet hypervigilant and unable to rest at midnight. Rest at midnight. This total subcortical breakdown launches a massive, uncoordinated electrical assault up into the primary gatekeeper of all sensory awareness, the thalamocortical relay network. Your thalamus acts as the absolute master switchboard of your mind. Every single sight, sound, touch, and internal body sensation must be forcefully routed through the thalamocortical relay channels before it is allowed to enter your conscious awareness. In a healthy, insulated brain, the thalamic reticular nucleus uses its dense GABAergic networks to cleanly edit this data stream, filtering out 99% of the external noise so your higher cortex can focus on a single task. But when the Stanford Leak short-circuits the thalamic relay hubs with extracellular plasma waste, the master switchboard suffers a total crosstalk failure. The internal filters break down. The brain is flooded with an unedited, chaotic storm of raw sensory data and background electrical static, an internal sensory smog that completely overwhelms your frontoparietal networks, making any attempt at deep analytical thought feel completely impossible due to the sheer volume of internal background noise. As the sensory smog overwhelms your higher networks, the microvascular leak inflicts immediate, localized structural destruction on the absolute archivist of your biographical memories, the CA1 cell field of the hippocampus. The hippocampus is an exceptionally fragile, low-resistance structure that is entirely dependent on perfect microvascular border control to protect its delicate hyperplastic circuits. When the Stanford Leak breaches this architecture, the local concentration of blood plasma proteins triggers a devastating downregulation of brain-derived neurotrophic factor within the dentate gyrus. The growth matrix is frozen. Simultaneously, the microglial cytokine storm initiates an aggressive, targeted pruning of the delicate dendritic branches within the CA1 tract. The archivist collapses. Your brain loses its physical hardware capacity to convert immediate short-term experiences into permanent long-term memory engrams. Your life story begins to slip through your fingers. You find yourself constantly forgetting where you placed an object, struggling to recall a conversation from yesterday, and losing the ability to retain new concepts, bankrupted by a memory bank whose physical filing cabinets are being eaten away by your own immune guards. Immune guards. The molecular decay of the gray matter nodes rapidly spreads along the high-velocity white matter tracks that connect your distant lobes, causing a widespread loss of structural tractography integrity across your entire bihemispheric network. Your white matter tracks are the long-distance, high-voltage fiber optic cables of your mind, composed of millions of long axons, insulated by thick, multi-layered sheets of fatty myelin manufactured by specialized oligodendrocytes. In a healthy border-controlled checkpoint, these cables are perfectly insulated from the surrounding extracellular spatial tracking data revealed that when the border control gates drop, the infiltrating fibrinogen triggers a catastrophic process of myelin sheath vacuolation. The insulation physically blisters and peels away from the axons. The fiber optic lines are left completely bare and uninsulated. Electrical signals traveling across your hemispheres face immediate latency spikes, voltage drops, and massive crosstalk desynchronization, reducing your brain's global processing velocity to its lowest historic baseline. The loss of white matter tractography integrity delivers a devastating mathematical blow to your brain's absolute crowning achievement, its global network efficiency. In graph theory, global efficiency measures how quickly and easily information can travel between widely separated functional modules across your entire cortex. In your 20s and 30s, your brain achieved peak global efficiency by using its hardwired white matter superhighways to instantly integrate memory, emotion, and analytical logic into a single cohesive moment of consciousness. But the Stanford molecular data demonstrated that as the white matter insulation peels away, your brain's network topology degrades from a highly centralized, high-velocity small world network into a chaotic, disconnected random graph. Information can no longer find the direct express lanes. It is forcefully rerouted through chaotic, slow-moving local side streets, dropping your capacity for complex, multi-layered strategic reasoning to absolute zero. This global network degradation marks the official physical emergence of the definitive leaky brain phenotype. Society looks at an individual suffering from this level of microvascular collapse and assumes they are merely experiencing a temporary phase of professional burnout, aging, or a lack of personal motivation. But the uncompromising data from Stanford Medicine has exposed a far more terrifying reality. The individual is operating a nervous system that has been structurally and molecularly compromised at the cellular floor. Every higher-order human faculty, your emotional resilience, your memory consolidation, your working memory capacity, and your strategic time horizons is actively failing because your brain tissue has lost its physical boundary control. The border is gone, the checkpoints are destroyed, and the internal computing matrix is locked in a state of permanent, low-amplitude electrical desynchronization that no amount of positive lifestyle adjustments or superficial coaching can ever hope to reverse. The consolidation of the leaky brain phenotype launches a final, fatal blow against your primary nocturnal defense mechanism, the glymphatic sleep gating axis. As we mapped in Phase 1, your glymphatic plumbing system relies on perfect astrocytic alignment to flush away the toxic metabolic waste generated by your thoughts during deep sleep. But in Phase 2, the Stanford data revealed that the complete retraction of the astrocytic end feet, combined with the loss of white matter tracking velocity, throws your brainstem sleep-gating centers into a state of total structural paralysis. The thalamic reticular nucleus can no longer close the gates of sensory awareness. You lose your physical capacity to drop into stage 3 slow-wave sleep and REM states. Your sleep becomes a shallow, highly fragmented, and unrestorative hypervigilant nightmare. The plumbing system is permanently turned off, locking your brain in a devastating feedback loop where the lack of deep sleep prevents the clearance of the microvascular leak, causing the toxic blood proteins to accumulate even faster, burning through your remaining synapses with unstoppable force. The breakdown of the sleep-gating axis forces your brain's primary workspace for conscious decision-making, the prefrontal executive buffer, into a state of complete metabolic bankruptcy. The prefrontal executive buffer is the physical hardware that holds your immediate data streams inside your awareness, allowing you to manipulate complex thoughts, resist immediate impulses, and direct your attention with absolute intentionality. This buffer is exceptionally expensive to fuel, requiring a flawless high-pressure supply of ATP and oxygen from pristine microvessels. But under the combined weight of uncleared metabolic waste, excitotoxic calcium fires, and mesocortical decoupling, the prefrontal buffer hits a hard resource wall. The electrical generators flatline. Your working memory space collapses to a fraction of its normal size. You find yourself completely unable to hold a complex thought path for more than a few seconds, entering a state of chronic mental paralysis, where your focus is effortlessly shattered by the smallest external interruption, leaving you completely bankrupt of the cognitive energy required to manage your life. This widespread downregulation of Claudin-5 exposes a highly critical, immediate anatomical vulnerability within the master regulator of your body's entire homeostatic matrix, the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is responsible for managing your baseline core temperature, your metabolic rate, your thyroid axis, and your circadian cycles. Because the hypothalamus sits right next to the third ventricle, it relies on a flawless, hyper-tight endothelial wall to protect its delicate hormone-sensing neurons from being flooded by systemic waste. When the Stanford Leak breaches this barrier segment, blood-borne inflammatory cytokines flood the medial hypothalamus. The neurons are destabilized. This is the precise neurobiological explanation for the severe, uncoordinated systemic disruptions seen in modern burnout, including sudden hot flushes, unprovoked racing heart rates, chronic low baseline body temperature, and an absolute collapse of metabolic flexibility, because the brain's master thermostat is literally drowning in blood-borne metabolic trash. The combination of tight junction fragmentation, astrocytic retraction, pericyte loss, and hypothalamic vulnerability culminates in the absolute collapse of the brain's microstructural microenvironment. In a healthy state, your brain tissue is a pristine, hyperprotected sanctuary where the electrical and chemical values are kept in a state of absolute mathematical perfection. But when the border control network experiences a total systemic breach, this sanctuary is transformed into an unregulated industrial waste dump. The extracellular fluid is filled with toxic albumin, destructive immune cells, and pro-inflammatory signaling proteins. Synaptic lines are short-circuited by foreign molecules, and the delicate dendritic trees are bathed in a chronic, toxic chemical soup. The brain loses its physical hardware capacity to maintain a clean computational space, locking your entire nervous system in a state of profound structural chaos that marks the end of Phase 2 and the definitive dawn of the clinical storm. We have now descended deep into the molecular underworld of the brain's border control network, witnessing the devastating cascade of the Stanford Leak as it tears through Claudin-5 protein lines, forces the structural drift of astrocytic end feet, and causes the absolute collapse of your microstructural microenvironment. But we cannot stop our exploration here, at the lowest floor of cellular destruction. In our final phase, we must climb directly back up to surface reality to examine the severe clinical storms, the rapid neurodegenerative onset, and the deep cognitive fragmentation triggered by this breach, before mapping out the definitive data-driven epigenetic reset plan to forcefully seal the leak and reclaim your brain's absolute sovereignty. As we cross into the final third of this historic anatomical exploration, the molecular chaos of the Stanford Leak breaks through the cellular floor and manifests as a devastating clinical storm across your daily consciousness, the onset of acute cognitive fragmentation. For decades, traditional medicine lazily dismissed subjective symptoms like brain fog, spatial disorientation, and mental exhaustion as vague psychological states or minor lifestyle issues. But the late 2026 Stanford dataset has turned this narrative upside down, proving that clinical brain fog is the literal physical sound of your brain's processing networks, short-circuiting as blood-borne toxins leak directly across your uninsulated capillary walls. Your thoughts are no longer traveling along clean, low-resistance white matter superhighways. They are forcing their way through an electrified, inflamed marshland of toxic albumin, causing severe signal latency, immediate working memory erasure, and an absolute collapse of higher-level executive processing. The persistent exposure to this blood-borne infiltration forces the brain out of its adaptive defensive posture and pushes it down a highly dangerous accelerated neurodegenerative trajectory. When the blood-brain barrier is left in a state of chronic, unmitigated breach, the continuous accumulation of toxic serum proteins acts as a direct catalyst for the formation of pathological aggregates inside your neurons. Albumin and fibrinogen molecules bind directly to specialized receptors on your microglia, locking them in an aggressive neurotoxic phenotype. The microglia stop acting as clean, disciplined data editors and begin launching a direct, uncoordinated assault across your healthy gray matter tissue, accelerating the accumulation of beta-amyloid plaques and tau pathology. This is the precise mechanical link discovered at Stanford. The leak is the literal master match that ignites the slow-burning fire of early-onset Alzheimer's and rapid dementia, proving that losing your border control network is the ultimate structural gateway to mental erasure. Mental erasure. This neurodegenerative fire is violently accelerated by the activation of a highly destructive low-level survival program known as the neuro-autoimmune cascade. In a healthy, connected human body, your immune system is kept completely segregated into two distinct branches: the systemic immune system, which uses white blood cells to hunt pathogens in your blood, and the central immune system, managed exclusively by the brain's resident microglia. Because your brain tissue contains unique, highly sensitive neural proteins that have never been exposed to the rest of the body, the blood-brain barrier must maintain a perfect wall of separation. But when the Stanford Leak breaches the gate, massive armies of systemic T cells and B lymphocytes flood straight into your cerebral cortex. The white blood cells look around this foreign environment, mistake your core structural myelin proteins for an invading virus, and begin launching an aggressive, autoimmune assault against your own long-range white matter cables, systematically dismantling your brain's internal communication lines from the inside out. The systemic invasion of your cognitive networks inflicts immediate severe structural trauma on your primary sleep-wake gating hardware, triggering a state of permanent glymphatic overload. As we mapped in our study of forgetting, your brain relies on the deep stages of slow-wave sleep to open its glymphatic channels, allowing clean cerebrospinal fluid to flush through your gray matter and wash away the metabolic debris of the day. If the blood-brain barrier is leaking continuously, the constant influx of heavy serum proteins completely chokes the glymphatic drainage pathways. The plumbing is backed up. The brain loses its physical capacity to execute its nightly cleaning cycle. This glymphatic backup traps the mind in a state of permanent nocturnal alertness, desynchronizing your circadian rhythms and locking your thalamic sleep gates in a fractured configuration, leaving you entirely unable to enter the deep, restorative sleep windows required to clear the neuroinflammatory storm and repair your endothelial walls. The mapping of this multi-layered architectural collapse exposes the complete, unscientific fallacy of traditional self-improvement, mindfulness apps, and superficial lifestyle advice. You cannot use a motivational quote or a positive thought to forcefully reconstruct a fragmented Claudin-5 protein wall, nor can you use pure willpower to command an astrocytic endfoot to instantly re-engage its structural grip on a leaking capillary. To seal the Stanford Leak and reclaim the sovereignty of your mind, you must abandon all shallow cognitive interventions and execute a precise, data-driven protocol of epigenetic reconstruction. You must treat your blood-brain barrier as a strict molecular engineering problem, utilizing targeted biochemical precursors, specific mechanical stressors, and potent endothelial stabilizing compounds to forcefully rewrite your genetic expression templates, upregulating the synthesis of tight junction proteins to rebuild the fortress from the cellular floor up. The first, non-negotiable objective of the epigenetic reconstruction protocol is the immediate activation of your endothelial cell's primary longevity software, the sirtuin-1 pathway. Sirtuin-1, or SIRT1, is a masternad-dependent deacetylase enzyme responsible for regulating the structural maintenance and genetic transcription of your blood-brain barrier walls. To forcefully kickstart this pathway and reverse endothelial decay, you must subject your system to a highly disciplined protocol of intermittent metabolic deprivation, specifically executing structured 24-hour water fasts combined with target supplementation of specialized sirtuin activators, specifically ultra-pure, bioavailable trans-resveratrol and nicotinamide mononucleotide, or NMN, administered precisely on an empty stomach. This targeted biochemical surge drives your intracellular NAD+ pools to their absolute historic maximum, commanding your endothelial cells to rapidly accelerate their cellular repair cycles and giving your border control network the raw genetic momentum required to halt the leakage of toxic serum proteins. The activation of the SIRT1 pathway opens a critical genetic window to forcefully upregulate the transcription of your primary tight junction defense, the Claudin-5 protein line. To command your DNA to manufacture these critical molecular seals at maximum velocity, you must manipulate an ancient cellular signaling matrix known as the WNT Beta-Catenin pathway. The WNT pathway acts as the master genetic switchboard that tells your endothelial cells exactly when to build tighter walls. To trigger this switch from the bottom up, you must introduce high baseline concentrations of specific lithium orotate matrices combined with fat-soluble vitamin D3 and vitamin K2 at an optimized clinical dosage. This targeted molecular payload stabilizes beta-catenin within the endothelial cytoplasm, forcing it to translocate straight into the cell nucleus, where it binds to your DNA and issues an absolute unyielding transcription command that floods your capillary walls with millions of brand new Claudin-5 and Occludin proteins, completely sealing the microstructural gaps before the next wave of toxins can arrive. What? The successful upregulation of Claudin-5 allows you to immediately begin the mechanical work of re-anchoring your retracted astrocytic end feet back onto the capillary walls, utilizing a powerful biochemical messenger called angiopoietin-1, or ANG1. Angiopoietin-1 is a specialized growth factor secreted by your brain's pericytes, behaving like a literal molecular anchor that binds to tie two receptors on the endothelial membrane, forcing the astrocytic end feet to extend their structural lines and lock themselves back into position. To forcefully simulate this pericyte signaling and drive an ANG1 surge, you must saturate your nervous system with potent, lipid-soluble neuroprotective compounds that directly cross the blood-brain barrier, specifically high-dose coenzyme 10 Guatemalan quetzals, in its highly bioavailable ubiquinol form, combined with pure, standardized gotu kola extract rich in triterpenes. This precise biochemical intervention restores the structural dialogue between your pericytes and astrocytes, forcing the end feet to wrap tightly around the capillaries, and rebuilding the critical secondary insulation layer of your border control grid. To permanently cement these genetic and structural gains, you must submit your circulatory system to a highly calculated mechanical conditioning protocol known as fluid shear stress optimization. Your endothelial cells are not passive building blocks. They contain specialized mechanical sensors that read the velocity and pattern of the blood flowing past them. When your blood flow is sluggish, chaotic, and uncoordinated, the result of a sedentary lifestyle, your cells register a drop in shear stress, which triggers an automated script to downregulate tight junctions. To reverse this decay, you must forcefully subject your capillaries to sustained laminar fluid shear stress through structured Zone 2 cardiorespiratory training. Running your cardiovascular system at an elevated aerobic baseline for 45 minutes 3 times a week forces your blood to slide smoothly and rapidly across the endothelial layer. This mechanical stimulation compels the cells to release massive surges of endothelial nitric oxide, or ENO, which instantly calms vascular inflammation, stabilizes the tight junctions, and hardwires the Claudin-5 matrix into a highly resilient, permanent configuration. So, with your border control walls successfully sealed and insulated, you must execute a rapid, aggressive purification protocol to flush the accumulated systemic infiltration completely out of your cognitive networks. As long as foreign albumin, fibrinogen, and pro-inflammatory cytokines are allowed to linger inside your gray matter, your microglia will remain trapped in an aggressive neurotoxic state, keeping your brain fog burning. To clear this toxic soup, you must forcefully upregulate your glymphatic drainage velocity through a precise combination of deep cyclic heat exposure and anatomical positioning. Subjecting your body to high-temperature dry saunas for 20 minutes raises your core temperature, increasing cerebral blood flow velocity, which must be immediately followed by acoustic-driven slow-wave sleep entrainment while resting your head at a precise calculated 6-degree incline. This strategic positioning forces your cerebrospinal fluid to flush through your extracellular matrix at double its normal velocity, acting like a literal high-pressure hose that vacuums the trapped albumin out of your cortex and dumps it into your cervical lymph nodes, completely clearing the clinical storm. The clearance of blood-borne albumin allows your brain to finally regate its primary data filter by repairing the GABAergic networks of the thalamic reticular nucleus, or TRN. As we mapped in our study of trauma, the TRN relies on its inhibitory neurons to edit out the sensory static of the outside world, allowing your prefrontal cortex to think clearly. But because the Stanford Leak flooded these thalamic nodes with blood-borne inflammatory cytokines, the TRN's gates were left completely uninsulated. To restore this shield, you must supplement your system with pure magnesium L-threonate, the unique, specialized form of magnesium molecularly engineered to cross the blood-brain barrier, combined with the high-potency bioflavonoid epigenetic. This biochemical payload directly amplifies the inhibitory GABA currents inside your thalamic nodes, cooling vascular hyperexcitability, closing the broken data gates, and restoring your brain's physical hardware capacity to filter out environmental noise with flawless ease. The regating of the thalamic shield triggers an immediate, powerful awakening across your primary network for strategic focus and executive authority, the frontoparietal control network, or FPCN. Cleared of the chaotic background noise of systemic immune infiltration and fueled by a perfectly regulated, nutrient-pure microenvironment, your internal CEO fully resecures its long-range white matter telephone lines across the hemispheres. The electrical conduction velocity along your axons jumps back to maximum adult speeds. This network awakening restores your capacity for deep, sustained intellectual focus, pristine working memory, and rapid abstract reasoning. You find yourself completely able to sit down for hours of dense, complex creative labor, completely free from the mental exhaustion or spatial disorientation that characterized the leak state, utilizing a fully repaired frontal infrastructure to run your daily life with absolute unyielding sovereignty. We have now mapped the complete trajectory of the Stanford Leak and its physical restoration, exposing the ultimate fallacy of sudden healing or passive recovery. We live in a culture that continuously tells burned-out, brain-fogged individuals that they just need a vacation, a positive attitude, or a few days of rest to recover their mental clarity. But the rigid, unyielding reality of structural network neuroscience completely obliterates this sentimental myth. Endothelial decay is a concrete physical breakdown of your cellular architecture. An internalized Claudin-5 protein will not slide back into place because you took a break, and an aggressive neurotoxic microglia cell will not drop its weapons without an absolute biochemical reset of its microenvironment. Recovery is not a passive consequence of calendar time. It is a calculated, aggressive biological intervention. You must stop waiting for a change in feeling and start executing a change in hardware, treating your border control network as a high-stakes engineering problem that requires a systematic protocol to solve. To maintain this newly reconstructed fortress over a multi-decade horizon, you must lock in the tonal balance of your vascular endothelium by managing your baseline insulin and glucose curves. Your blood-brain barrier is exceptionally sensitive to systemic metabolic health. Chronic spikes in blood sugar trigger a continuous release of advanced glycation end products, which act like tiny physical razor blades slicing through the delicate glycocalyx lining of your cerebral capillaries. To protect your Claudin-5 walls from this quiet erosion, you must implement a strict protocol of continuous glucose stabilization, utilizing a low-glycemic, nutrient-dense ancestral dietary framework, while implementing targeted metabolic stabilizers like berberine hydrochloride or pure dihydroberberine before your largest meal of the day. This precise intervention keeps your systemic insulin curves flat, preventing vascular inflammation and ensuring your endothelial cells can maintain their tight, high-resistance configurations without experiencing premature metabolic decay. The successful stabilization of your insulin curves locks the brain's microstructural microenvironment into a permanent state of pristine homeostatic perfection. The extracellular fluid surrounding your neurons is completely cleared of toxic albumin, foreign white blood cells, and destructive inflammatory cytokines. Your synapses can now fire across a clean workspace, entirely free from the short-circuiting noise of blood-borne infiltration. The internal electrical and chemical values of your cortex return to their optimal textbook parameters, multiplying your baseline cognitive efficiency, sharpening your sensory processing, and giving your higher executive networks an unyielding physical bedrock upon which to compile your thoughts, your memories, and your strategic choices high-resolution clarity. Avumedi. With the microenvironment secured and the endothelial wall reinforced to maximum density, the systemic autoimmune threat is permanently eliminated from your nervous system. The invading armies of blood-borne T-cells and B-lymphocytes are completely cut off at the gate, unable to pass the dense, newly minted Claudin-5 and astrocytic barriers. The resident microglia, relieved of the toxic stimulus of foreign serum proteins, drop their aggressive neurotoxic phenotype and return to their optimal evolutionary role as highly disciplined, quiet data editors. The uncoordinated assault against your healthy gray matter stops instantly. Your long-range white matter cables are protected from internal sabotage, halting the trajectory of accelerated neurodegeneration and ensuring that your brain's internal communication lines remain perfectly insulated and operational across your entire lifespan journey. The elimination of internal immune warfare allows for the final triumphant return of your internal priority compass, the saliency network. Anchored in a fully restored, high-voltage anterior insular cortex, the compass resets its sensors with absolute precision. The semantic blindness that characterized the leak state flatlines. Your brain regains its physical hardware capacity to compute contrast and calculate priorities across your surroundings. Tasks, deadlines, and personal milestones are assigned their clean, data-driven value tags once again, completely removing the heavy, numbing static of mental indifference. You develop an immediate, intuitive clarity regarding what truly matters, and what can be safely ignored, giving your conscious mind an irresistible internal drive that effortlessly guides your focus toward high-value, productive action. The restoration of your priority compass allows your brain's internal narrative engine, the default mode network, to undergo a profound process of healthy integration. With your frontoparietal networks running at peak operational voltage and sending powerful top-down commands, the autonomous toxic rumination loops are permanently silenced. The internal monologue that generated a lifetime of self-criticism and catastrophic simulations vanishes. Your DMN is cleanly re-anchored into a safe, high-vitality interoceptive reading provided by a fully repaired subcortex. Your brain stops using its processing power to run endless diagnostic audits of why you are exhausted. It returns to its true evolutionary mandate, compiling your life experiences into a highly cohesive, meaningful, and empowered narrative of personal mastery. This widespread global stabilization culminates in the final, complete establishment of what network neuroscientists call the monopoly of sovereign intelligence. Your brain has officially transitioned from a democratic, chaotic, and uninsulated network open to systemic contamination into a highly centralized, top-down hierarchy. Information is no longer allowed to wander through chaotic side streets or get short-circuited by blood-borne waste. It is forcefully and automatically routed through elite, hyper-insulated rich club hubs, giving you unprecedented intellectual speed, strategic reasoning, and emotional resilience. You have built a cognitive fortress that runs its personal empire with absolute, automated precision, completely protected from the volatility of the external world. We have reached the absolute finish line of this historic architectural exploration of the Stanford Leak, mapping the full journey from border control breach to total structural transcendence. The rules of human neurobiology are unyielding, but they are also beautifully plastic when targeted with data-driven precision. By understanding that your brain fog and exhaustion are not psychological moods, but the physical reality of a leaking blood-brain barrier, you claim the precise keys required to dismantle the trap. Through sirtuin activation, WNT pathway manipulation, shear stress aerobic conditioning, and glymphatic clearance, you systematically rebuild the fortress from the cellular floor up. You've transformed your brain from a vulnerable, contaminated network back into an elite, high-velocity instrument of sovereign human consciousness. The machine has been completely mastered. By understanding the deep, uncompromising neuroscience of this path, you have claimed the absolute biological keys to rewrite your code, lock down your borders, and claim permanent, absolute sovereignty over your cognitive destiny. Over your cognitive